Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Joe. I am with the Heartwood Refuge Sangha, and I'll be presenting a Dharma talk for you this afternoon. Or morning, depending on where you are. I know folks in California might be. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Joe. I am with the Heartwood Refuge Sangha, and I'll be presenting a Dharma talk for you this afternoon. Or morning, depending on where you are. I know folks in California might be. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Joe. I am hang on, folks. With the Heartwood Refuge Sangha, and I'll be presenting a Dharma. Okay, we're back. I am both presenter and technical support today. I am presenting from my home. There were some individuals at Heartwood this week that were tested positive for COVID. So as a matter of caution, we will typically try to do things remote. Thanks to COVID-19, over the last couple of years, we've developed some capabilities around that. So we can have a Dharma talk regardless. I am giving the Dharma talk today because Panyawati, our venerable monastic, abbot of Heartwood Refuge, and her student monastics, as well as some of the lay folks, are out on the West Coast for the month of August, taking a retreat and learning about, among other things, the Heart Sutra. So we wish them well, hope they're enjoying their time. In the meantime, we're going to try and keep things going here at Heartwood. So without further ado, today I want to talk about, and if any of you are familiar with any of the previous Dharma talks I've given a few, we typically go into some Buddhist topic, oftentimes that I'm not familiar with. So it gives me a chance to research. In this case, I wanted to touch on something and try to touch on something that is becoming the kind of the way I see. I'm starting to kind of see through the lens of the Dharma, and it takes the form of this idea of no self, and trying to live that out and really seeing things through this lens. So I wanted to talk about that, and in preparation for this talk over the last week or two, just kind of thinking it through, thinking about it. What could I share, and how would I approach it? I happened to be in a local grocery store, and they had a Lion's Roar magazine, and I always look and see, what's this month's, what's the subject, and I'll show you what I saw. No self, no suffering. So I said, well, there's the sign. So what I'm going to do, they do a good job. I'm not going to read this article in its entirety, obviously. I've got a few other things to share with you. But I thought they did a great job setting up the problem. So if we're going to talk about no self, then we have to understand what that means in Buddhist terms. We have to kind of look back. We've, in the previous talks that I've given, looked at suffering, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, right view, dependent origination, which is kind of a detailed take on why we suffer that the Buddha gave us. So we've gone into this rather than rehash any of that. I just thought it would be great to have the folks at Lion's Roar tee it up for us. So I'm going to read a little bit here, and again, we'll get some help to set this up, and then we'll come back. So no self, no suffering. This is by Melvin MacLeod. He's actually the managing. What is it? He's the editor-in-chief of Lion's Roar. So he says, the Buddha made a big promise that if we know the cause of suffering, we can end it. Buddhism famously says that everything we're looking for, happiness, the end of suffering, even enlightenment, is found right here in this life. But what is this life? It may be much vaster and deeper than we think, both less real and more real. And perhaps more importantly, what it's not. Because according to Buddhism, the whole problem is that we misunderstand the true nature of this life. The Buddha said we make some fundamental cognitive errors about who we are and what we experience, and these cause our suffering. Looking at it that way, the whole Buddhist path is nothing but a way to get from who and where we think we are to who and where we really are. The Buddha's teaching on this path and the insights behind it are summarized in 4 simple statements. These 4 truths are called noble because they liberate us from suffering. So these will be the four noble truths in his words. He says, our truth number 1, our lives are pervaded by suffering, both obvious and subtle. Obvious being obviously, there's wars and there's famine, and we can see that people suffer in the world. It's easy to point that out. But then subtle, how psychologically the beliefs and the conditioning that we have may cause us suffering in ways that aren't easy to see, even for ourselves. So the first truth, our lives are pervaded by suffering, both obvious and subtle. Second truth, there's an identifiable cause of our suffering. Because we know its cause, this is the third truth, we can free ourselves from suffering. And number 4, there's a specific path we can follow to end suffering, which consists of meditation, wisdom, and ethical living, virtue. This 4-part logic is the world's first, and to my mind, he says, still greatest self-help formula. Buddhism is not only self-help, it's the ultimate self-help. I know this borders on heretical, he says. After all, isn't the very definition of Buddhism anatman, which means no self, no soul? Isn't Buddhism famous for its doctrine of non-self? So if there's no self, how can there be self-help? But no self is actually a kind of shorthand. It doesn't mean there's no self at all. We exist, obviously. It means no mistaken self. It means that the type of self we deluded beings believe in doesn't exist. So the type of self we believe in doesn't exist. That's the problem. So in fact, so what is this false sense of self, and which is also often called ego? He says it's the mistaken belief that we're a separate, independent entity with some sort of unchanging personal essence at our core. This self doesn't exist. It's a fiction we create based on our ignorance about the true nature of ourselves and reality. But because we believe this self exists, we struggle to serve and protect it, and cause ourselves and others endless suffering in the process. It's the false organizing principle of our lives. So who then are we really? What is our true self that's obscured by this mistaken self? He says one thing we can say with certainty is that in our true self, there's no hint of the mistaken or fictitious self. All phenomena, including us, are the products of infinite causes and conditions. There is nothing that is separate or independent. When we realize that we are interdependent with all things, we see we are not separate from anything or in conflict at all with reality. Our minds and hearts are open by nature. So that's our true nature. Thich Nhat Hanh called it interbeing. There's another big question about Buddhism, he says, and self-help, which is whether self-help is only about helping ourselves. In reality, if we know what's truly good, we don't have to choose between ourselves and others. It's only the mistaken self's narrow and superficial definition of self-interest that makes us think we have to choose between our well-being and that of others. When we know what truly makes us happy, things like a loving connection to others and living a meaningful life, then there is no conflict. What helps me helps you, and vice versa. My real happiness and yours are not separate. And it turns out one of the very best things we can do for others is to be happy and whole ourselves. When we're not driven by our small, mistaken sense of who we are, we're skillful, resilient, and caring, and we radiate love and joy. We show others that happiness is possible. By practicing these four truths, we diminish suffering, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. So he says, today we can expand the first noble truth to include all the suffering in society and the family. We can see how billions of people suffer because of unjust, uncaring, and violent political, economic, and social systems. How trauma and suffering are passed down from parent to child, generation after generation. We can see the causes of this suffering are also rooted in ego, or this mistaken view of self. The basic misunderstanding of self, and how ego's anger, greed, and indifference operate on a vast collective scale in society. We often say that life is a struggle. What that really means is that it's a never-ending struggle to maintain our sense of ourselves as separate, independent, and at some level, permanent. That's a painful and futile struggle because it flies in the face of most fundamental qualities of reality, which are change and impermanence. As the Buddha famously said, all compounded phenomena disintegrate. And yet we try. Endlessly, moment after moment, we struggle to create a sense of ourself, which inevitably changes and disintegrates and must be recreated. And no matter what, we will lose everything in the end because we will die. In a real sense, this whole mistaken self, the whole mistaken world we create to confirm it, is nothing but an attempt to deny the reality of death. And he adds, but there's another kind of suffering we need to add, the suffering caused by other people and their egos. And so he goes on to say how, this suffering expands just from our experience and from us and how we interact in the world and can create suffering both for ourselves and the others in our immediate environment. But this is also kind of happening on a global scale and being passed down through generations, et cetera. So, not understanding this, what was laid out here kindly by Melvin in The Lion's Roar, is in Buddhist thought the cause of the suffering in the world. It's the cause of all the suffering that we ourselves experience and propagate. So I wanted to take a look at a few things. I've got a screen that I'll share here. I wanted to take a look at a few things before we get into kind of, how we can handle this and what we can do about it. And I'll share some of the experiences and the practices I use to try to get at this. Not directly to try to get at it. I wouldn't say that I took up these practices knowing what the outcome would be, but certainly after having used certain practices for the last few years or so that I've been involved with Heartwood and the teachings there, I can say that I'm really, really, really starting to see through the lens of no self. And so hopefully through the rest of the talk, we'll get a sense for what I mean by that. So let me just share this screen here. So what Melvin just laid out in that article is the pervasive truth of what are called the three poisons. Greed or desire, this constant craving, and then attachment, hatred, usually coming from aversion. I don't like that. I don't like you. I don't like the way you treated me. hatred, anger results from that, etc. And all stemming from this delusion that, I am this sort of entity in the world, that the things that I experience are mine, that sort of, I experience these things, and I experience what you do to me, and it's all very personal. And so those are the three poisons as they're stated in Buddhism. And so that's what the problem is. That's kind of the shorthand for the Four Noble Truths, in a sense, and the outcome of it. It's what we carry around. It's what causes all the trouble. It's what people are doing every day. As we see on the news, people are acting out hatred. They're saying what they do and don't like. The entire news broadcast is based on what people like and don't like, mostly what people don't like, it seems, and then what can be done about it. So what depicts our experience with this view, right? With this, we carry around these three poisons. We have this view that's defined by these three poisons, and our experience of it is that things are either good or bad for me. And in Buddhism, that's called the 8 worldly winds or worldly concerns, that I experience gain or loss, pleasure or pain, praise or blame, and fame and disgrace. All of this has to do with me. It's my experience of the world. I'm experiencing this. If I'm experiencing something bad or painful, you may have to hear about it, right? Because I want to share what's happening with me. If I'm upset about something, if someone said something to me that made me feel disgraced in front of others, this causes the suffering that we're talking about. These are all the causes of this same suffering in a little more detail. So like most wisdom traditions, I guess Buddhism is tough to put in a category of a religion per se, but in some countries it is. But in any religion or system like that, we have some kind of guidelines for how to be, how to behave, virtue. What does it look like? What's the moral code for me to be a good person? And so in Buddhism, we have these, 10 precepts, if you will, wholesome characteristics, right? And it involves abstaining from killing living beings. That's not just killing people. It's killing anything else that's living, right? Abstaining from stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, malicious speech, harsh speech, gossip, coveting, ill will, and having a good understanding of the Dharma. This is a Buddhist list, so you're going to have that, right? The Dharma is the path or the teachings. So we can see how, by following these, stay out of a lot of trouble in the world. We can see how, again, all we got to do is put that newscast on and see who's talking about what. And we can see that, gossip, harsh speech, malicious speech, false speech, can really cause problems, right? People put that out there and then someone else needs to react to it. So we can see how this can keep us out of trouble. But for the topic we're going to discuss today, I want to say that these, as a starting point for anyone, taking up a spiritual path or a religious path or adopting a faith, these are good guidelines, and we should follow them. They are going to teach us about ourselves. And again, what keeps us out of trouble, what keeps us from harm, but also keeps us from harming and causing suffering for others. However, that very focus of keeping ourselves from suffering and not causing suffering for others because of how they might view me potentially, or whether they might throw me out of the club, or whatever it is, it's still all about me, right? So there's a potential trap here, that, we can abstain from killing. I mean, I know if I go out and kill somebody, my life is just going to take a whole new turn. I'm not going to be in control of my life anymore. The police will be looking for me and all that. I'm going to avoid that by not killing anyone. That's how I'm going to handle that. But that's all about me. Now, that doesn't mean that I should go out and kill somebody. I'm just trying to point out that as we get into the next, 40 minutes or so, that we're going to see that this focus, as Melvin laid out for us, on this self that we sort of aggrandize and seek praise for and defend and seek to protect, is really kind of what's causing a lot of our suffering. So we want to have good virtue. We want to act properly in the world. We want it to be for the benefit of all beings, as kind of the first thing, not just an aside. And so just something that occurred to me, thought I would point out. Okay, so moving on. So Buddhism goes further into what are called the four immeasurable states of mind, the Brahma Viharas. And this is where, as a practice, so certainly we have that, the code of conduct, the morality focus there, and we can practice those things. We can watch ourselves and make sure that we're practicing those things. We can see the benefit of doing those things. So that's all a good practice of sort of, monitoring our behavior and kind of mindfulness around that. The next step, at least in Buddhism, is, and I think many of the spiritual traditions around the world have this, something like this, or what are called the Brahma Viharas, the four immeasurable states of mind. The first one is loving kindness, an all-embracing love. And I'll say that the reason I wanted to make sure that we talked about these is because now you're going to see that every single one of these has to do with not you. It has to do with others, other living beings, not you. Right? So starting with that then, limitless loving kindness. So this is defined as an all-embracing love, dedicated to serving the highest welfare of all beings, like a nurturing mother who protects and cares for her children. This sublime love brings comfort, tenderness, warmth, and understanding to those in need. A prayer that you might use to sort of send loving kindness out to the world or to an individual in your life, someone close to you, etc., might be, may all beings have happiness in the causes of happiness. Now, one of the things I'll point out is every single one of these has the word limitless. So when we start out with these, we may use visualization techniques or contemplative techniques to kind of send, we sit and maybe close our eyes and practice trying to send, get in touch with our heart, really try to send and imagine sending loving kindness, either to someone close to us, family members, people in different groups that we belong to, the Sangha here at Heartwood, for instance, and then, our country, the world, etc. And then going out to all beings is one way to practice, but you're using kind of a visualization technique. This is not inherently how you are, right? You have to create this. And so that's why it needs practice. But ultimately, each of these, that word limitless, if we practice and if we're sincere about it, over time, more and more, this does become an innate quality of who we are and what we can offer and how we really see and feel about the world and others in it. So that's loving kindness. Limitless compassion. In some other traditions, they might call this mercy. It's a wise, heartfelt motivation to relieve the pain, sorrow, and the suffering of others. And a prayer for that might be, may all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And the way this starts out is, if we're looking at ourselves and being mindful and practicing some of those wholesome guidelines, and looking at ourselves and how we interact in the world and trying to not do harm and those kinds of things, then we're going to learn about ourselves and we're going to learn ways that we suffer. And then once we begin to learn to be able to see that, we can then see how other people suffer. We say, oh, I know what he's doing. I do that too. So we develop compassion. It comes naturally. It's this thing we kind of develop. So the deeper we go in our practice, this idea of compassion naturally wells up. If we're becoming free from suffering and we see everyone suffering around us, then we naturally, our heart goes out. We want that to change, and we'd like to somehow, be able to bring that about. And so that's what compassion is. And this limitless compassion would be that you're so moved by the suffering of others that it literally might cause you even physical pain. So it's where it can go, but that be the limitless aspect of it. And so we practice to sort of try to get to a place that we don't quite understand yet, right? We don't have these things in a limitless capacity. They're not who we are. We want to develop them. So we practice. Limitless sympathetic joy, our genuine ability to rejoice and delight in the happiness, success, and good fortune of others. And a prayer for that might be, may all beings never be separated from the supreme joy that's beyond all sorrow. So how many times do we see people achieve something they consider a success? And depending on who that is, and whether or not we wanted that to be our success, we may or may not have an upwelling of sympathetic joy, of spontaneous joy, right? But we can remind ourselves that we'd like to. So when we see ourselves judging a certain type of situation, someone announces, that something good happened to them and they're proud of it, but we have a certain opinion of them. So we're not happy for them yet, or we're not happy for them at all. Maybe we're even critical of what they think they're so happy about. In hindsight, we can look back if we're trying to practice and we can say, I should really just be happy for them. And so you may or may not actually get happy for them right then, but this training can help to shift our mind. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to cultivate these things in our mind. And then limitless, non-differentiating generosity. It's this imperturbable composure of heart, a love that embraces all living beings and circumstances equally with wisdom and serenity. A prayer for that might be, may all beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion, right? The three poisons. And we want this for everyone. We don't differentiate who we're generous to, who we have this generosity for. When we get to the point where what in our limited capacity now, we could imagine to be the worst person we know. When that person is no longer the worst person we know, and that we can be as equally generous with them as we could be to anyone we love or care for, in our family and in our sangha or what have you, then this is when that starts to become part of us. It starts to become limited. But initially, we have to catch ourselves not doing it, but to know that these things are there for us to be aware of, and to have the aspiration to want these things to be a part of your character, a part of the quality of yours, is that on its own. And then just finding a way to remind yourself of these things, maybe on a daily basis, what have you. Some people wake up and they remind themselves of something like this, and that's how they start their day. And then they go about their day. And then they might look back later in the day and say, how did I do? So this is how we get to these things. And by, these things can start to become part of who we are. And we don't have to work so hard to generate them. Okay. So there's a bit of a quality around, practicing some of these things, and a lot of the Buddhist teachings, a lot of any teachings, even Jesus' teachings, right? He might have said something like, do unto others as they would do unto you, as you would have them do unto you. Well, that's going to take practice, right? It's not just going to happen because you hear it, every third Sunday, or whatever it is. How often you hear that from a preacher or from a priest or anybody else that's speaking, on any kind of regular basis. You're going to have to actually sort of do something about that. Try to do it. In a way, you could kind of think of that as fake it till you make it, right? We have that concept in other areas of our lives. Fake it till you make it. So let's give that a try. So that's the Brahma Viharas, and that's where so many of the Buddhist teachings involve what's good to do, what's not to do, and how you can see the benefit or detraction of any of that. These Brahma Viharas are where we start to see how Buddhism also wants us to get off of this limited view of this thing we're always trying to build and protect and construct and reconstruct and defend and fight about and all that. We want us to get our minds off of that. And the quickest way to do that, the easiest way to do that, it's kind of a hack to me, is to focus on giving ourselves away. Focus on getting our attention off ourselves, letting go entirely of who and what we think we are. Stop building up, defending, and protecting this false self, and begin operating exclusively for the benefit and well-being of others. Now, we're all somewhere on that continuum, right? We're all somewhere along, but that's the aspiration. And there's something called in Buddhism the Bodhisattva path, where this is your aspiration. You are living life and hope to have an existence that is solely for the support and for the elimination of suffering of all beings everywhere, right? It's a huge aspiration. Obviously, we're not there. I remember when I first heard, that vow, as it's sometimes called, and how that bothered me. And I said, geez, I don't know. I'm just trying to, have my life be better now. I mean, can I work on that for a while? and the truth is we can. But there was something so appealing about the idea that I might want to be a force for change, a force for good in the world, in the universe, maybe even, right? And so it's attractive to me. But I remember feeling like, wow, I mean, can't even imagine. But that's okay. We can fake it till we make it. And so I said, well, at one point I came to a kind of a crossroad, and I said, well, let's assume I don't have the mind that can really conceive of what it would be like to be that one, whether, you want to call it a saint or whatever. Maybe I just can't conceive of it right now. My mind is too limited. My view is just too narrow. I'm still too busy with my self-interest and my self-concern. Maybe there's a way to be that's so far beyond all that what I'm struggling with here is just perfectly natural to who I am, but I don't know it yet, right? So all of this are ways that we can sort of practice getting our eyes off ourselves and chipping away at this tendency to do nothing but constantly. I notice every time I move my hands, the video is moving. Sorry about that. Constantly protecting, defending, and building up this false self, according to the philosophy. So if we buy the philosophy, then what do we do? Cultivation. So cultivation is what we do. And those practices we mentioned in the Brahma Viharas, and this Bodhisattva path, and the practices that might be a part of it. We're going to look at some of those. What we're trying to do is transform our minds from the kind of the limited view that we have to something far more expansive. And these practices are ways that we can work to shift our minds out of a limited view into a more expansive view. So shift our minds away from attachment, greed, ignorance, into things like loving kindness, compassion, self-mastery, all informed by wisdom, right? The Buddha master, Dorje Chang Buddha III, who is our Venerable Panyawati's teacher. He's recently passed. Nevertheless, asserted that the cultivation and practice, shifting our minds, was really 90% of the path. So when we look at Buddhism, we have, virtue, cultivation of virtue and training around that. We have meditation, and we have wisdom, and the way I view it, wisdom is kind of the outcropping of our practice around kind of getting to know ourselves, and maybe some of these other practices help get our view off of ourselves and kind of onto others a little bit. That all is kind of in that virtue bucket. Meditation is a way we can directly experience non-attachment. And then wisdom is what develops out of those efforts. We begin to have insights and see the world in a certain way. So 90% of the path, though, is this cultivation, shifting the mind, changing the way the mind habitually reacts to our conditioning and various circumstances based upon how we grew up, what we did for a living, all the different ways that sort of we're conditioned to sort of look and see the world, to cultivate a new, more expansive way to be in the world. Requires cultivation. It requires shifting our mind. He said that's 90% of the battle. And we know even in meditation, if you study meditation, you'll run into the idea that there are hindrances to meditation, and they have to do with things like anger and doubt and ill will, right? That when we conduct our lives with those things in it, then when we sit for meditation at the end of the day, we might not be able to obtain the peace that meditation is supposed to be able to give us, because as soon as we sit down, we're guilty about something we did during the day, and that enters our mind, and then we can't let it go, right? So these become hindrances. So I think it's part of the reason, it's not just for meditation, but part of the reason in this path of becoming whole, and much more than just this thing that we're trying to protect, this self, that 90% of the path is changing our mind in the habitual tendencies we've developed over a lifetime, many of which we couldn't help. I mean, when you're a kid, a small kid, you're getting what the world is giving you. You're absorbing what's being. So it's nobody's fault that we have this conditioning and that we have this to get out of. But the good news is that we can do something about it. One of the things I love, there's a sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya called 114, and it's what to cultivate, what not to cultivate. And it says, we can cultivate wholesome or unwholesome behavior. And it goes through 7 or 8 or 9 different areas of behavior and activity in our lives, from physical to mental, other areas. And says, well, there's you can either cultivate wholesome, and here's what that looks like, or unwholesome, here's what that looks like. But both are essentially cultivation. So we have to realize that this mind is highly trainable, highly trainable. Good news. However, it's highly trainable. So if we train it with things that cause ourselves or others harm, behaviors, habits, tendencies that continue to cause us suffering, then we're going to get suffering. If we train it with things like the Brahma Viharas that have, a more beneficial effect on the world and on ourselves, then our experience will be different. Our experience will change. But both things are being cultivated. So when I see how people are with their minds, I mean, I see the world around us, and I guess I'm somebody who's probably not the best practitioner, but I feel like I'm training my mind by and by. The things I try to pay attention to are training my mind in a way that I want it to go. Panyawati loves to say, what we think and ponder on becomes the inclination of our mind. And I just see people all around me all the time, including myself, that are training their minds in ways, they're acting in ways, they're speaking in ways, they're interacting in ways that are not beneficial, not wholesome, not skillful in the sense that is going to come back to you, right? But as soon as we say those words, as soon as we have that thought, as soon as we take those actions, we're training our mind. That's cultivation too. I love that. I love that sutta and the way it laid that out. And it's a mantra of mine. It's become a mantra. Anybody that knows me probably has heard that from me. You know, I'll point to somebody doing something that I think is crazy or unbeneficial or a waste of time, and I'll say, that's cultivation too. That's cultivation. Buddha Master, I heard a quote, said something where he said, don't fear making mistakes. And this has to do with cultivation. Don't fear making mistakes. Fear not correcting, right? Because if we don't correct the mistakes, we're never going to get any better. We're never going to get any happier. This suffering caused by this myopic view we have of this small, limited self isn't going to change. So he says, don't fear making mistakes. Fear not correcting them. So that's his admonition. So I want to talk a little bit about how I have come to this. And it started with this little pamphlet, a teaching by His Holiness Dorje Chang Buddha III. We also call him Buddha Master for short, affectionately, I would say. And he gave this teaching actually in response to a question by one of Panyawati's masters, Master Zazi-Zuma. And she asked the question, what is cultivation? And so he gave this, and you can see it's a little pamphlet, you know, several pages, but, you know, maybe 20, 25, 30 pages, 33 pages. And in it, he describes what cultivation means. And he talks about shifting the mind, and he describes, you know, how is this really going to work? And he describes the requirements for whether or not this is going to work, whether or not you're really going to be successful in shifting your mind at all. And he gives these practices. And so I was exposed to this pretty early in my Buddhist career. It was probably, I don't know if it was year one, but it was pretty close to that. And there was a retreat that Hartwood held, and to go over this. And prior to that retreat, I had learned a little bit about the Buddha Master. And I said, you know, this could be an important teacher in the world. I should go to this retreat and learn this teaching. You know, what do they offer? It sounded good, right? Cultivation. I knew enough about Buddhism that cultivation was important, you know, that we need to somehow try to walk this out, not just learn teachings. And so in here is, you can see, a section where he talks about some practices. And these are contemplative practices that you can use to sort of get at. And there are two sets of 7 branches, as they're called. And the first is great compassion for my mother, Bodhichitta. Now, Bodhichitta is a form of compassion seen in the Bodhisattva world, and in those teachings. It's compassion tempered with wisdom. It's the ultimate compassion. You have ultimate wisdom, and from that you have ultimate compassion, right? And this is Bodhichitta. And what we're trying to cultivate is that, right? It's that ultimate equanimous, you know, really want to help alleviate save living beings from the suffering of the world. So, and there are 7 parts here. I will, I'll read each one of these and then just talk briefly about it. The first is understanding who my mother is. It says, I deeply understand that all living beings in the 6 realms of reincarnation within the 3 spheres of the universe have since beginningless time been my fathers and mothers in the revolving cycle of reincarnation. Well, at the time I ran into this, I had reincarnation on the shelf. I think I've told this story before. So already struggle, right? And this is typical of what happens in Buddhism for me, because it's not what I grew up with. It's not the culture I was a part of. And so these teachings and the language around some of this can be a little bit like, wait, I'm not ready for that. I don't know what to do with that. I had put that up there and I was sort of, enjoying some Dharma talks and things were making sense. And I feel like I can work with some of this, but I wasn't ready for that. Right? So this threw me right into that. And I kind of left the reincarnation thing on the shelf and tried to make the best use I could out of some of these tenets. So that's the first one. And then the next one is bearing in mind kindness. It says, I should deeply bear in mind that all of my parents that now exist in the cycle of reincarnation have since beginningless time given birth to me, reared me, loved me, and became tired and ill for me. Their kindness to me is as heavy as a mountain. I should bear in mind their kindness. I will then regard the suffering of my parents as my own suffering. So it's that, it's again getting to this idea that when we see the suffering of others, if someone's, being coming to us, adversely or acting poorly with us or coming to us with ill will, we're getting to this idea that we might be willing to tolerate that, patiently tolerate that, because that's going to benefit them more than us somehow going into this, sort of what are we trying to protect ourselves and how do we need to defend ourselves and all that, and then feed that back to them. Ever experience how those conversations never seem to end? So who really benefits when that happens? No matter how right or wrong we believe we might be. So, I will then regard the suffering of my parents as my own suffering. Eyes off yourself, right? This stuff is going to take you way into not you. This is not you. If you really want to get to being able to sort of have an existence that is for the benefit of living beings in the world and others, then it starts to be how it looks. But we take things from where we are. We don't have to buy all of this right off the bat. We take things from where they are. And that's kind of how I've approached this. A lot of this doesn't shake me at all anymore. It's funny how time heals all, I suppose. Repaying kindness. So first we had understanding who my mother is. And, I use these, just so you know, I use these. The recommendation coming out of that retreat was that we should practice contemplating these on the pillow. I remember, in those days I worked. I've since retired, but I worked and very busy schedule, sales organization, sometimes meetings at 8 a.m. and going till, 6 or whatever, and just, driving around to go meet people and all that sort of stuff. So I had a limited amount of time, and this will illustrate kind of the point of the importance of cultivation. I asked the question, well, I meditate in the morning and in the evening. I have a certain amount of time for that. That's it. So if I'm going to add something like this, should I add it? Or should I replace one of those meditations with this? What I heard was actually a little surprising. And it was, you should replace it. And it's because 90% of the possibility of accomplishment on the path will come from the cultivation of our hearts and our minds. The rest will take care of itself. You do this for a bunch of years. You finally sit down to meditate, you might go flying, right? So that's the idea. So that this was most important. And so I began to incorporate this into a daily contemplation. I think that I did that for like a year. And I did the best I could with these concepts. But I lost my mother when I was young. I was 2. So the first one here for me is a way, and they said we could pick, someone to be the focus of these things. We could pick someone, or we could pick, we could make it, all beings, but certainly we could pick someone that was close to us, or even that was an adversary. And we could do this contemplation with them in mind. And so I used my mother, and I used my stepmother, my father, and then others in my life, friends, my wife, my son, right? And I would do this contemplation and use them as kind of targets. Man, you talk about opening your heart. But this first practice, understanding who my mother is and bearing in mind kindness, and this idea that anybody we encounter in the world could well have been, if we're okay with reincarnation, the idea that we're all sort of going around this endless cycle of rebirth because of this ignorance that we're involved in, at this level, that we're trapped in this thing called samsara, then it's possible that the guy I played tennis with was my cousin in a previous life. It's possible, right? So I can allow for the possibility. That's okay. So I began to kind of look at people like I would my mother, and all of a sudden, instead of sitting around at the gym, sitting on a machine, nothing else for my mind to do but sit around and judge who's fat, who's this, who's that, I started looking at everybody. If that was my mother, how would I treat her? Wouldn't I roll out the red carpet? And so it really begins to inform how we can see the people that we encounter in the world. We don't have to see them as adversaries. We don't have to see them as, better or worse, or somebody to compete with, or any of that. We can just see them as our mother. If they were our mother, especially the one we lost, how would we treat them? Wouldn't we roll out the red carpet? Wouldn't we want to, pull out a chair, sit down here? Can we get you anything? All that. Wouldn't we want to serve? And so that's the idea. So we have understanding who my mother is, bearing in mind kindness, repaying kindness, right? I understand that my parents have offered me everything. My parents and all living beings offered me everything. So you can see how your parents are a pretty easy target for this kind of thing. And Panyawati always makes a distinction, even if your parents weren't the best, in your opinion, still they got you here and you have this opportunity. So maybe that's worth repaying at least. So I understand that my parents and all living beings have offered me everything. They're now revolving and wandering in the 6 realms of reincarnation, experiencing endless suffering. I resolve to take action to enlighten myself and others, to save and liberate my parents, i.e., all living beings, in order to repay their kindness to me. Then loving kindness. At all times, through the action of my 3 karmas, I am loving and kind toward all living beings who have been my parents. I wish them a long life without illness, good fortune, good luck. Sounds like one of those Brahma Viharas, right? That's one of the Brahma Viharas. That's one of those 4 immeasurables that we talked about earlier. Compassion, another one. Day and night, I constantly beseech all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, if you're in a different tradition, saints, to empower all of my parents, living beings, so that they may extricate themselves from all forms of suffering, encounter and practice the Buddha Dharma, or whatever wisdom teaching is going to help them get free of suffering and liberate themselves from the sufferings of cyclic existence, right? This hamster wheel we're on with reincarnation and just suffering over and over again, suffering, happiness, suffering, happiness, suffering, happiness. And then renouncing greed. I hold no attachment in my mind to anything I do to benefit any living beings. In other words, this isn't about me. who have been my parents. I cultivate non-attachment to all my good actions of body, speech, and mind. Thus, my good actions become natural and spontaneous. That goal of those Brahma Viharas, right? Natural and spontaneous, as my original nature is good. I do not do good purposefully, with some, return in mind or some, I do good and then I forget about it. It's not about me. I love that one. And I use that. I do good and then forget about it. I use that all the time. When I want credit for something, I see my mind going there. I'm like, no, do good and forget about it. And then it says eliminating attachment and not being attached to any Dharma. Should eliminate all attachment to self, realizing a state of emptiness. So the prize of these practices, the promise, is what the Buddhists call emptiness, which is essentially another way, or at least in shorthand terms, of saying no self. This limited self, this self-view that causes all the trouble, has a very concrete nature, right? Very concrete to us, we believe. In reality, though, it doesn't. It's completely empty. Yet it exists. So there's this paradox in this thing about emptiness. It could be a whole nother Dharma talk just about emptiness. And then there are a couple others that I use. There's a second set of 7 branches, and this is called Bodhisattva correspondence. And there are a couple in here that I've used quite a bit, and I continue to use. They've really become mantras for me. One is self and others are equal. When there's a conflict of interest between myself and others, I will rid myself of hatred, antipathy, greed, and arrogant, disparaging mentality. I must not emphasize benefiting myself. I should treat myself and others equally. I'm going to talk about a couple of these in a minute, so we won't. I'll just read through. Exchange between self and others, Bodhichitta. I want to bear the sufferings of all living beings. I give to others all my happiness and good luck, so that they may leave suffering and obtain happiness. Benefit others before self. When other living beings and I are suffering, I want others to extricate themselves from suffering before I do. When other living beings and I are happy, I want others to be happier than I am. I remember getting taken back with some of these when I first encountered them. But with practice, telling you, you can get to it. And then dedicating merit. Dedicating merit. This is something that we do often in the Sangha when we sit and we practice something together. We'll dedicate it to merit at the end. Whatever in Buddhism, it's believed that we obtain merit by practicing our virtue, cultivating these, Brahma Viharas, things like that, cultivating these themes here, that we obtain merit, which is good energy, karmic benefits that go to our credit, right? So let's say. And that can become a reason, possibly another trap, why we might do things. When Buddhism is a religion and the idea of acquiring merit is emphasized in a culture, and that you gain merit potentially by, feeding monastics, and there's a whole system of where monastics might, beg for food on a daily basis, and householders gain merit by providing or serving the monastic community. Then we can get trapped in doing things for the merit. But here, this says dedicating merit, bodhicitta. I dedicate to all living beings all of the merit and accomplishments from my cultivation in the hope that they will leave suffering and attain liberation. Don't want this for me. I want to give this away. So much of this is, if we truly understand, I'm not saying I do, but these practices are taking you to a place where there's an understanding and there's a way to be that has nothing to do with this, with protecting and aggrandizing and defending, this limited self-image. That we're much more than that. That this existence of ours is much more connected and much more expansive, on a universal level than we can even know from our standpoint right now. In that, things like dedicating merit, give it away, give it away, give it away. I don't want it for me, because that's a trap of, I'm getting merit, therefore I'm going to be safe. Maybe today I'll take a break. I got so much merit yesterday, right? This is a hindrance. So we want to give these things away because we're trying to de-promote our tendency to see everything in terms of how it benefits us or doesn't benefit us. Then there's some others here. There are 3 others. I'm going to leave them for now and talk about those couple. We're a little past 1 o'clock. Typically, these Dharma talks can go to 1:15. The official time for this is 1 hour and 15 minutes. So I'm not officially over time, but apologize if anybody's got someplace to head off to. This is being recorded on YouTube, so you can catch it there. So we've been talking about, my use and what is cultivation, and kind of looking at what's in there. And so for me, aside from that practice of sitting with those first 7 branches of, starting with, who is my mother, and then going down through loving kindness and sitting with that, sitting with various people, really, really a heart opener for me. And something that I can practice, even bring into the gym, sitting there, looking out, what can I do with my mind? Well, maybe I'm judging somebody. Maybe they're on a machine that I want to get to. And I'm going, man, that guy just sits and talks on that thing. Catch myself, run through the 7 branches. Suppose he's my mother. How am I going to treat him? Can't wait to get over there and talk to him, right? Can't wait to get over there and, hey, Mama, it's me. So, some observations. Self and others are equal, Bodhichitta. There's a book that we read as a group on Tuesdays in the Sangha. It was called Becoming Bodhisattvas. It's about the Bodhisattva path. It was a commentary from Pema Chodron on a text that was written many hundreds of years ago that talked about and laid out kind of the Buddhist path. It was by a monk at that time. And in there was this concept of, because, none of this stuff we're talking about here this is the Bodhisattva path. If it wasn't in this book that happened to come from, a particular tradition that Panyawati and her master Zizi are a part of, then there is a thing called Vajrayana and Mahayana in Buddhism, and these things are part of that. So this Bodhisattva path is not a unique thing. It's something that's well known, and so there are many books on this that you can access. And so we studied this book together, and one of the things that caught me beneficially was this concept of just like me. And so here I'm out there trying to practice these things. Self and others are equal. Every time I'm judging somebody, I'm trying to catch myself and get back to self and others are equal. And she had this where she was describing and commenting on a certain section of her book and what the monk's original text. And she said, just like me. And it's getting to this idea of self and others are equal. just like me, realizing we all see ourselves as the central character in life's drama. Like me, they're enslaved by attachments and aversions, hopes and fears. No one wants to experience physical or emotional pain any more than I do. We all want to feel safe and free from fear. So, you stand in a line at the grocery store and the person in front of you is fidgeting all around. They look like they're impatient. They get to the checkout and, maybe they're giving the checkout person a hard time. They just seem to be out of sorts. And tendency would be to kind of see that and get agitated by it, judge it, and say, But this is a way that we can kind of use. We can say, oh, just like me. If I had something go on just before I came in here and I needed to get back to, or if when I came in here, my phone rang and, I saw it was a certain person, and it's an important thing, yet I needed to get this thing for, maybe my mother's at home. I needed to get this thing. So I needed to come in here, but I really need to get out of here. And so maybe I would be impatient too. Maybe I would be nervous too. So self and others are equal. I heard on a podcast one time, and I have a tradition back in my 20s of meditation and kind of yoga and those traditions. And there's a greeting called Namaste, where you see someone and you go Namaste. And I heard on a podcast that was a scholar who was, talking about, kind of the real meaning of things and the real history of things. And he happened to mention that Namaste actually means I greet the whole person in you, faults, greatness, and all. I greet you without judgment. When I heard that, self and others are equal, came right back. Because I can make that association, I was able to remember and use it. And have a different way that in my mind I was using it. So, but again, self and others are equal. Interesting little aside, I've been carrying insects and at one point mice, out of my property, for a few years now. There's this one of those 10 wholesome behaviors or characteristics was not killing living beings. And in Buddhism, that includes insects and whatever pests we might determine come into our lives. And so can't hurt. I've gotten pretty good at carrying insects, spiders. Got a pretty good little technique, catch them with get them with the tissue, don't crush them, get them into a little bubble, fold the tissue around, carry them outside. Works every time. I haven't killed an insect, and some of them are, you would think would be hard to, but by doing that, I think that it's actually giving me a sense for seeing them as equals as well. I remember watching a show about insects, and they showed insects really up close. And they showed the lives of they took a few insects and they showed, kind of the life cycle and how they live. And I realized they're all doing what we're doing. Like this, they're doing what we're doing. They're seeking food, seeking to procreate, seeking to survive, even thrive. They have senses like we do and a mind that allows them to solve problems and overcome obstacles. How am I any different than them? How are we any different than them? At least on the level of acting out this physical life, right? So self and others are equal. It even applies at that level. And thanks to my willingness to practice that one Buddhist idea of trying not to kill any living being, it seems to be helping me just see everything a little more equally. So, and then the other one that we encountered in What is Cultivation, the little pamphlet, was benefit others before self, Bodhichitta. And so, just a couple of quick examples here. I had a back injury recently, took me out of commission for 4 or 5 weeks. And so I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't be anywhere. Eventually I got to where after 3 or 4 weeks, I could actually sort of play tennis, but I still couldn't sit down. So it was hard to be anywhere. And so, my wife and others would be, wanting to do things. And, my wife was doing her, things on her own, a lot with other people. But she would always ask, hey, you want to come out? Then other people would be asking me, hey, is Joe coming? And so one day I got a little upset, feeling like, these people aren't seeing me. Right. And I felt this need to sort of, lash out a little bit, like, you're not seeing me, Instead, as an alternative, if I'm practicing benefit others before self, is I could have practiced, well, as an alternative, I could have seen how many weeks of illness, how my many weeks of this illness was actually affecting others. And I could have had compassion for how they might have been suffering as well. So I think I arrived at that, but that was after, this is hindsight. But as we try to sort of change these things, even in hindsight, the time between, them happening and us sort of, eventually they stop happening altogether because we see it even as the tendency arises within us and we just don't act it out. Feeling disgruntled about having to cook today. So every now and then, I'm tired, maybe I want to get to something else, whatever, I'm committed to cook the meal, I'm cooking the meal, catch myself, maybe my wife is off, reading a book somewhere. She looks like she's relaxing on the eating pad, whatever it is. And I think to myself, man, I'm cooking it today. But benefit others before self. I want Susan to be happier than I am. Once I actually sort of embrace that thought, I'm actually good now too. Problem solved. No more agitation. And then, Sue's mom comes all the time, and her stay is an offering that we make to her. So certainly, why would we pause the, poison, our offering to her with any selfishness around competing with her needs? So I have a practice when she's around, knowing that, she's an elderly woman, she's 90 years old, she just turned 90, that, her needs are going to be much greater than mine. I'm all set. The house is here, we've got what we need. I'm all set. I can adapt to just whatever it is that comes up that she might need. And so I'm all set. So I can really kind of put her needs first. And as a result, there's always this parting comment that we hear about, from my wife's brother, who she stays with over in another part of the state. Says, I'm so peaceful when I go there. And you can tell she has no clue why. But we're starting to feel like it's partly because I think that my wife and I are in the house, we're becoming more and more empty of self, more and more empty. We don't really have competing needs. And so we can embrace people more fully when they come to us. So wrapping up, some final statements. Getting at this, you can see how, we're trying to get our eyes off ourselves, and with various practices to help us be able to do that. And this is about attachment to this limited self view, right? Attachment to that, I have this identity and things are mine. The Buddha master in a couple of different places says, so the question is, so how do I know when I'm not attached to self anymore? And one of the things he says is, well, if you come across your adversaries and you still give rise to revenge, anger, or hatred, that means you haven't yet cut off attachment to self. So I got a way to measure it. I can measure it by how I'm interacting in the world. I got a way to kind of see how I am with people, how I am with circumstances when things come up, how I am. I can see my attachment to self very clear. And the world starts to be a benefit. I'm trying to get rid of this. How can I do that if I can't see the ways that I'm attached? So I wanted to leave. So I wanted to say that, I'm really, really starting to experience the freedom of not having to sort of so vigorously protect and defend, this identity that, I've spent my entire life creating. We have miles and miles of judgments and autonomic kind of conditioning, thoughts and behaviors that we sometimes act upon despite our efforts. That becomes that window into becoming aware of more of this kind of shadow that we're trying to shine light on. And there's just so much freedom in not having to protect, defend, or promote this limited self. And the reason we can so easily tolerate a slight and overlook the faults of others is because we're less and less protecting our own self-image. And we're more and more free to see others as they truly are, with no thought as to how that impacts us. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I hope this was beneficial. With that, we'll wrap up with a brief dedication of our merit for our practice here today. May all living beings become free from suffering. May they encounter a tradition, some kind of teachings that allow them to see and realize freedom from suffering, freedom from attachment to self, and truly be free and happy. Be well. Thank you.